All right, welcome back to the Coach's Corner with our PCC podcast. And I'm back here again with Coach Julia again today. And today we're doing a little continuation of the last episode that we did about how do you know when to get testing done? How do you advocate for it? Where should you go? Why should you do it? And today we're going to be going deeper into these tests specifically, like how can functional labs transform and optimize your health? We gave a little bit of personal anecdote on the last episode, so you can go back to that if you want to just hear a little bit more. But this is a pretty hot topic right now. I feel like it's all over social media. It's become more popularized. Like I'm talking to women in the DMs and like most of them know what a Dutch test is, but they have no idea how it can help them or if they need one. So we're going to break down the key tests that we've honestly kind of leaned more on with our clients lately, and just kind of how they work and what the results mean and how you can implement results from tests like this to optimize your health. When you go to your doctor and you get labs, typically the things that you're going to get, and just fill in gaps for me as I'm listing this off, Julia, but like you'll typically get the CBC, with differential, you'll get the CMP, so complete metabolic panel. You'll typically get like a TSH, maybe a lipid panel, maybe an iron panel, depending on your doctor, and maybe some of the sex hormones, depending on what phase of life you're in and what the doctor warrants for you. But pretty basic, and we're really just seeing like overall, which is it's great to see overall health markers, but we're not seeing super in-depth stuff with like our hormones and definitely not our gut. Is that right? Is that about everything?
Yeah, and with the lab markers, they typically, like you said, they'll order like one instead of the whole panel. So like for your thyroid, we see TSH. That's fine and dandy. But unless you have like T3, T4, like reverse T3, like all of those actual values, you can't really do anything with TSH. Same thing with like hormones, like our sex hormones. They'll order like estrogen.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, but there's different types of estrogen. We need to know, is your estrogen high in relation to your progesterone, because it can be normal estrogen and then like tanked progesterone.
Yeah.
So yeah, typically I love lab work to see like your cholesterol, right? Your triglycerides, your blood sugar, right? But for thyroid, reproductive hormones, all of that, it's not my favorite.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we do have an entire episode on like the differences between interpretations. So I'll just add that to the show notes. But essentially, you can get labs done from just your annual physical, your doctor, but a lot of the ranges are much, much wider than what would be considered optimal because it's the range of what is not diseased. And we very well know that we can feel like crap and not be diseased. So that's another piece there. Typically, we've seen a lot more Dutch tests, GI maps, full thyroid, and just going deeper on that. So let's start with the Dutch because this is near and dear to my heart too. And I'll let you kind of take it away. I'll just add on like little anecdotes here and there, but to just kind of break down the Dutch.
Yeah, so when you think of lab work, you go to a LabCorp or a Quest, they take your blood, and that is a snapshot in that moment of what everything's, looking like. A Dutch is not a blood test, but it's actually a urine test. So you take different urine samples throughout the day. It's like right when you wake up, morning, afternoon, evening, and like right before you go to sleep. So all throughout the day. And it's not only seeing, your hormone levels in that moment, but how they are trending, throughout the day. Because maybe your cortisol is super, super, super low in the morning when it's supposed to be at its highest. And then it's super high at night when it's supposed to be its lowest. But if you just got lab work, it would just tell you what was my cortisol in that moment, not throughout the day. And then with your hormones, I won't go into all of them because there's literally dozens, but it looks at how your body is using those hormones and what pathways they're going down. So just say your estrogen, right? You have different types of estrogen in your body, and it shows, does your body actually use the estrogen that is being produced, or is it just floating around and recirculating back in your body, right? So it shows very, very specific pathways. For estrogen specifically, there is like a good pathway, right? A favorable pathway. And there's also like a bad pathway that can lead to breast cancer. So it's showing you really important information for how your hormones are being used, how much are actually free hormones, how much are being, metabolized. And then it shows you other things like your vitamins in your body, right? Your B6, your B12. It shows your feel good hormones. So your dopamine, right? Are you actually feeling happy throughout the day? And then obviously like cortisol, stress, melatonin, all of that you need for your stress and your sleep. But it shows you everything throughout the day. So it gives you a nice picture of like, holy crap, I need to figure out what my nighttime routine is and why my cortisol is so high at night.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's why I like it so much more. It's not just a one-time snapshot, it's a trend throughout the day, and it's showing how much your body's actually using out of what's being produced. So
Mm-hmm.
it's the best.
Yeah. Oh, and it just came back to me the other thing I was going to actually say earlier, but it ties in here nicely. With the Dutch, you have to take it at a certain time of your cycle for it to be representative of your hormones at a certain point in your cycle, typically days 19 through 21. And I was going to say the same thing about when you go to get like traditional lab work. Like you go when your appointment is scheduled with your doctor, not when it's like timed up with your cycle, unless they've worked with you on that. But typically you want to see that day 19 through 21 to see that midway through the luteal phase, because that's a great marker of like really seeing the levels as they're kind of flowing and peaking versus if you were to go right after you finish bleeding, then like everything's just going to be low because that's where they're supposed to be. Well, hopefully they'll all be low, but that's where they're supposed to be at that point in the cycle. So with the Dutch, it's also like you're taking it at that time of the month, but it's showing you so much more of like the pattern. And for me, that was everything because it's like, do I need to figure out something to change in the morning? Do I need to figure out something to change at night? And everyone's a little bit different. So like we can say dysregulated cortisol, but like there's probably like a bunch of different little subtypes of high at night, high in the morning, low at night, low in the morning. That makes the treatment plan, quote unquote, a little bit different.
Yeah, definitely. And just seeing different pathways, it's like, holy crap, like my estrogen is being, like for me, it was recirculated back into my body, which puts me at a higher risk now for breast cancer. And just like
Mm-hmm.
the pathway being the unfavorable pathway, it's like, okay, we got to get this estrogen out. And for me, like getting estrogen out of my body was through two main ways, not supplements, not anything specific. It was through sweating and pooping. Like that is
Mm-hmm.
how I got estrogen out of my body. And you don't know this. Like that's not like a common knowledge of how do I get excess estrogen because I was estrogen dominant out of my body. And it was like sit in the sauna and figure out your bowel movements. And that's how like I healed my estrogen dominance. Not supplements, not dim, nothing crazy.
Yeah.
Um so yeah, it just gives you like that eye opening, like, holy crap, there's so many things going on in my body. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I know when I sent you my Dutch test for like a second opinion, you were like, sweat more, poop more, touch some grass. And I was like, yep, I definitely need to do that. Okay. So then so we kind of went in the last episode, like when should somebody take certain types of functional labs? We didn't go into the types. So
Mhm.
what are some of like the common symptoms that make you say, all right, this person would probably benefit from a Dutch?
Yeah, I think the first one's going to be your menstrual cycle. Do you have a long cycle? Do you have a short cycle? Are you spotting? Are you heavy bleeding, like really heavily bleeding? Are you suffering from amenorrhea, right? Like, do you just not have a cycle for months at a time? Do you have any like crazy PMS or like PMDD, like just crazy premenstrual symptoms. So that's like the hormone side of things. That would be a huge red flag of like, let's definitely see. And then on your side, you ordered it primarily because you were really low energy, that brain fog. So that is, a second red flag. And I think the third one is not being able to lose body fat, right? Or see fat loss when you're doing all of the things and you're checking all of the boxes. That would be like the third one is like you're doing all the things like your steps and your workouts and your nutrition and your water. And like we said in the previous episode, like just nothing's happening, even though you're doing everything right. So I think that would
Mhm.
be like the third reason you would order a Dutch test. And that's a lot what we're seeing too is like there's a reason, right? You're not doing anything wrong. It's just your body's fighting against you.
Yeah, definitely. It needs a little more TLC.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. And I even, there's definitely been some of the hormonal side of things too. Like I was kind of experiencing both.
Mm-hmm.
And what's funny was, and I actually was explaining this to a client the other day, and I think it'll probably be helpful for somebody listening. Like for, let's say our demographic, like highly driven, like type A women that just go, go, go all the time. Like my experience with like finally warranting being like, all right, let me just like cough up the cash and like buy this thing and do it. Like it was not warranted by just the fatigue. Like I was tired all the time, losing my train of thought constantly. Like I like literally if we were doing this podcast right now 3 times at this point, I would be like, I forgot my train of thought. And that was annoying, but I was like, you know what? I'm just tired. And then
Mm-hmm.
like really feeling just like wired at night and like just having like sleeping for 8, 9, 10 hours and still feeling exhausted. Um, and the brain fog would just last all day. That I literally was like not okay with that, but like I didn't think it could be different. It was when my body started to like show me, and I always talk about it like your body is like whispering at you, and then it'll start to talk to you, and then it will scream at you. And it
Mm-hmm.
was starting to yell, I would say. But I started like breaking out all around here,
Mm-hmm.
like constantly, not even just at certain points in my cycle. And it was like really just like more painful, like large acne than I've ever had. My PMS and my cycles were just worse than they've ever been. Like keeled over on the floor, fetal position, crying. Like never had cramps like that before in my life, and I'm blessed and grateful to say that. But it was a really hard swing where I was like,
Mm-hmm.
whoa, what is this? Right. And so I think, yeah, maybe I could have caught it earlier, probably could have gotten a Dutch test done 2 years ago and still seen some stuff be wrong. But for me, it was really that. And I was explaining that to one of my clients who's going through perimenopause and is interested in this now. And she was like, that makes a lot of sense because, like, I guess I am tired all the time and I do have brain fog, but I didn't think that warranted anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And even seeing a trend was the last two or three Dutch tests that we reviewed were
Yeah.
all like healthcare workers too. So it was like
Mm.
that is definitely a population who you're working night shift, you're working 312s, you get home and you're still having to be a mom. You're still having to be a wife. You're still having to, do things outside of just working, a crazy, hectic type of job. So I do think that a lot of that is just like it's normal. I'm just tired, but we've seen that it's gotten to the point where it's really really hard to like have your body screaming at you and then heal things comparatively to like if your body is just like talking to you like hey let's get this figured out. It's a lot easier to kind of get out of that.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of like we were talking about with preventative versus reactive medicine. Like we've kind of been trained to think that way too, but like, whatever point you catch it at is better than nothing. So,
Yeah.
um, okay. So then the Dutch test overall, I think pretty much covered. Is there anything else that you wanted to add on that one?
Um, I don't think so. I will say that it's really, really overwhelming when you see a Dutch test and you see the
It's
results.
so long.
And there are like 20 pages of information and graphs and charts and arrows and different colors. And it looks like everything is wrong, right? So just if you do order a Dutch test, if you're not, working alongside us, but you do end up ordering one, just know it is going to be okay, right? Whatever the results say, there is an answer. So just it's very overwhelming to read a Dutch test. So that's just
Yeah.
a disclaimer that don't get overwhelmed.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, and there was one more thing I wanted to mention for like what warrants maybe getting a Dutch test
Mm-hmm.
is there's a case here and there where like I'm working with a client and we're not hitting the basics, like we're
Mm-hmm.
not like doing all of the things, but they are so kind of just tanked out and like they can't sleep well, they have no energy all day, that becomes the thing that's actually getting in the way of them doing anything.
Mhm.
That sometimes it's like jumping to the test in those circumstances where we've tried every behavioral and mindset intervention and they still can't really get themselves to do anything,
Mhm.
barring like needing mental health treatment, because there are like a lot of times those go hand in hand, right? Like struggling with anxiety, depression, as well as that. It's like if they're getting the help on that side, they're doing the behavioral things with us, nothing's budging, and like it's purely like a physiological brick wall in their way,
Mhm.
then sometimes getting the tests in to know like what supplements would like fast track alleviating some deficiencies and improving quality of life, like that is also one where I'm careful to jump to, but like I will when we've kind of checked all those boxes on our end.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Sweet. All right. Let's get on to the GI map. I am really just like a little bit newer to the GI map, so I'm interested to hear. But the reviews that we've done for clients have been really insightful to learn more about the gut microbiome.
Yeah, so a GI map. So there's a lot of different, gut testing out there where it might be like a food sensitivity kit, right? Or an allergen kit. Um, and those are showing, sensitivities, and that's great. But a GI map is, once again, like super overwhelming to see all that information, but it's a comprehensive tool, right? It gives everything you can possibly think of in your gut. And the gut microbiome is so complex, right? You have your gut brain axis, right? So there's a lot of information about like the whole mental behavioral side of things that you get from that. It's also like where your immune system, is mainly created in your gut. So there's not just like, oh, I'm digesting food bad or oh, I'm bloated. Like you're looking at immune sensitivity, right? Seeing if you have like an elevated IgA, which could be like celiac disease or IBD or stuff like that. You're looking at how your digestive enzymes are, right? Do you even have the tools in your belt to digest the food, right? Is that the first thing? And then it also looks at bacteria, right? So infections in your gut. It looks at viruses, like if you've ever had mono, right? It'll show if you still have like a lingering Epstein-Barr virus in
Hmm.
there. And then unlikely in a lot of, of our typical client, but it does show parasites as well, which I've seen,
Hmm.
but it's not very, very common, right? Parasites are something that hopefully, cross our fingers, none of our clients ever see, but
Yeah.
it is going to show it if you do have that infection in your body. But what I primarily look at, right? That is a ton of information, but what I primarily see causing the gut issues is actually just your gut microbiome itself, your good bacteria and your bad bacteria. That's like the number one thing that we're seeing right now is there's an elevation in the bad bacteria and a decrease in the good bacteria, which is just causing a ton of gut dysbiosis, a ton of imbalance in your gut. So that's the number one thing that I'm seeing right now in GI maps is just chaos with the
Hmm.
bacteria itself, which if you think of taking like antibiotics, right? Anytime you go to the doctor, you have a cough or you have an infection or you have some sort of illness or whatever it may be, you're given antibiotics. And if you're not taking a probiotic to, combat that, those chronic antibiotics can really, really mess up your gut balance. If you're not eating, a nutrient dense diet, right? You're not eating fruits, veggies, whole grains, fiber, that can 100% mess up the overgrowth of the bacteria. There's just so many reasons that you can have that imbalance, but it causes, a huge chaotic wrecking havoc on your gut if you just have like really, really high bad bacteria. So that's kind of what I've been seeing in the actual tests and what it measures. But most of the people that are ordering a GI map have, once again, just shown like that bloating, constipation, diarrhea,
Hmm.
food sensitivities. Like no matter what they eat, they're just not digesting it well. And then a lot of the times also acne.
Hmm.
A lot of people with acne, like for me, that was the cause of like a lot of my cystic acne was having, H. pylori, and that infection was like showing on my face. Um, so yeah, it does more than just testing if why you're bloating, right? It shows like
Yeah.
so many different things from your brain to your immune system to your infections, parasites, all of that.
Yeah. So do you know how, like, because the dysbiosis can come about from like even just our diet and like that accumulating over time, antibiotics, like how do these infections come about? Is it from like getting sick and then it just stays in our gut, or do you know anything about that?
Yeah, antibiotics and medications, right? If you're taking chronic like NSAIDs, right? You're taking acid reducers,
Okay.
just different types of antibiotics that can cause, but also chronic stress, right? If
Hmm.
you are chronically stressed, your inflammation is going to be increased, right? And inflammation in our gut causes it to slow down, and then it impacts like the bacteria in there.
Mm.
Food poisoning, right? That's another
Okay.
one. Like if you had food poisoning and there's still bacterial infections and it just never heals, that can kind of shift things around. Toxins, right? If you're chronically using things that have, parabens and sulfates and heavy metals and pesticides and things like that, that can really mess up and cause infections.
Mm.
And then obviously like processed, like ultra processed foods, um, refined sugars, stuff like that. But I would say the number one thing like causing infections would be like antibiotics, medications,
Okay.
food poisoning, and then like stress.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
big one. Okay. Yeah, because I know so it's kind of like basically a lot of these gut issues are really the byproduct of a accumulation of like many, many things over the course
Hmm.
of time. And then eventually we it gets to the point where like it's symptomatic, and then it's
Hmm.
symptomatic to the point where we're like, okay, now let me look at that.
Yeah. Yeah. Environmental, mental, your diet, some things like you can't control, right? If you do have like an autoimmune disease that gets triggered, um, but some of it is things you can control. So
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna save more questions. We should do a whole episode on the gut and GI maps
it's
because I
complex. It is like learning how to read a GI map was definitely something that I was just like, I didn't realize your little gut has so many functions in our body. It's crazy.
yeah, yeah, and it affects so much. And even the thing that's fascinating to me, I think the most, is the mental health through the vagus nerve, that connection with the gut and how it can really impact that. So, yeah, let's do a whole episode on that. So
Hmm.
TBD. I'll leave you guys hanging on that one for a little bit because we got to get to the thyroid.
Yeah.
So, the next one is our full thyroid panel. You had kind of riffed these off either in the last episode or in the beginning of this one. But our full thyroid panel, as we mentioned, is not just our TSH, but our T4, T3, free T4, free T3, reverse T3, and then our TPO antibodies and TG antibodies. And like all of that together is a comprehensive thyroid panel.
Hmm.
So just kind of like long and short of it, right? Um, can you kind of walk through just like the chain reaction of the thyroid hormones and how we determine like subclinical dysfunction from that instead of just TSH?
Yeah, so TSH, it's produced by the pituitary gland, right? It signals your thyroid to release all of these hormones, right? So your TSH being normal is just showing that it's supposed to be producing, hormones because it's sending that signal. But it doesn't mean that the hormones are actually being produced. It just means that the signal is being sent.
Mm-hmm.
So if TSH is normal, that just like is saying like, okay, your body is capable of sending the signal, but it's not telling us that it's capable of actually producing the hormones, if
Mm.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're comparing the optimal range is looking at what we want to actually be seeing, whereas just like the clinical values, you're being compared to an average American.
Yeah. We know
Do we
that's
want
not.
we don't want to live
Yeah.
the life of an average American, so I'd rather not fall in that range. So then looking at like the other ones that you had already named, T4, right? That gets converted into T3. And then T3, that's the active form of the actual hormone that regulates everything, right? T3 is like the king of everything. I always like to say it's like the most important one. If I can only see one, T3. Because
Mm.
T4 is converted into T3. T3 is what is controlling your metabolism, controlling your energy, controlling your body temperature, all of that. So if there is like low or high T3, like that's always the red flag for me. There's
Yeah.
also an inactive form of T3, but as long as I'm seeing T3, like that's like my number one for seeing like the actual thyroid hormone itself.
Yeah.
The other ones you named, they're important if you're seeing things like Hashimoto's, Graves' disease, hyperthyroidism, hypothyroidism, right? Seeing like
Mhm.
actual disease of the thyroid. But the TSH with the T3 and the T4, that's like your metabolism.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that's like the full panel. It's really cool to see like how one starts, sends a signal, then it's converted, and then there's like a bunch of like pathways it goes down. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's why we like to see more than just TSH.
It's so important. And like the number of women that have thyroid, like overt hypothyroidism, or like have suspicions of their thyroid being off, and
Mm-hmm.
then they just get TSH back and they don't have the education behind like what these hormones actually do. Like you have to like really research endocrinology to know this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really it's frustrating when like someone is like, oh yeah, I thought my thyroid was bad, but like it's fine. And I'm like, just send me what you got. Like literally in the DMs, I'm just like, just send me it. And it's like, then we see subclinical dysfunction. And I'm like, no. And I had someone tell me in the DMs like, I actually cried reading your message because you were the first person to have said like that I'm not just normal, like that
Mm-hmm.
something's actually could be wrong. And so we're not throwing out diagnoses here in the DMs. We're not doing any of that. But I think it is important for people to know like what these ranges are versus like just following blindly like what comes back on the lab report. So yeah, definitely. And I think in our lab guide, yeah, actually we could probably put something together. We could probably put together like a free resource of like what's
Mm-hmm.
the functional range versus what's the Western medical range. And I
Mm-hmm.
like lots of disclaimers will need to go on that, but I'm sure we could put something together for that.
Yeah. And like you said, like we're not ever trying to like diagnose a disease or diagnose a specific, dysregulation or dysfunction, but more so just giving you the tools, right? And
Yeah.
giving you that like voice to advocate for yourself, right? That's a huge thing is like us being the messenger to give, these women the voice or give them the tools to be like, hey, something's not normal and
Mhm.
going to their, endocrinologist or going to, their OBGYN and asking for these things because you just don't know to ask.
Yeah.
Or you don't
Exactly.
know it's, not normal. So that's like a huge thing I always say is like, we're giving you that push.
Yeah. And we're definitely just like I always like to say like you are not your diagnosis, right? So whatever diagnosis you have, that is not your new identity. It doesn't mean anything about you, right? So getting these numbers doesn't mean that like that's something that's
Mm-hmm.
inherently tied to you now. It's just something that is going on that you can control, that you can have an influence over
Mm-hmm.
versus feeling like, okay, we're labeling this and now this is like my whole personality, right?
Yeah.
Because as we discussed, actually, go back to the last episode that we just did and listen to how the physiology, the behavior, the psychology all plays into how these things come to be in the first place. So you can realize that it's like it's about you as a whole human. It's not just like your lab panels defining you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just kind of close it out by saying, for me personally, my medical history, is never ending. Very long list of a million diagnoses. And my sister went to a rheumatologist yesterday because she's been uncovering some autoimmune diseases as well.
Oh, wow.
And he took a look at my diagnosis list and he goes, "Is she on disability? Like, is she a functioning adult?" And she was like, "Yeah, she's a full time worker. Like, she's a health coach. Like, she competes in bodybuilding. Like, she does all these things. What do you mean, is she on disability?" And he was like, most people with that extensive of like a medical history would just take that as like that's it, like there's no healing from this type of thing. She was like, yeah, no, she's doing great. So just from like a physician to say like, is she on disability or is she like a functioning adult, I was like, yeah. So
Yeah.
not using your diagnoses or like not seeing the results from your Dutch test or not looking at your GI map results and thinking like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to heal from this, because you can.
Yeah. It's there, the tools, the labs, these tests, they're there to empower you rather than enable a
Mhm.
victim mentality. And I think that's why like you're such like a walking inspiration of that for your clients, because I mean, I think it really is remarkable just the amount of different conditions that you have been diagnosed with, but how you really do just walk the walk and you're more than functioning, you're thriving, you're literally killing it in everything that you do. So I think it can just be a vision, like honestly, of like what can progress actually look like when you are seeing some of these dysfunctions. For me, it's literally like night and day energy. It's
Mhm.
having focus, not losing my train of thought, being able to get through a whole workday, sleeping for 8 hours and only needing eight because I'm well rested after
Mhm.
eight, and so much more, and just regular, easy PMS cycles and things like that.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, any final thoughts on just, what if someone were to take these tests and then go into a protocol, address it holistically, like how can their life really change? Like how can they really manage symptoms and conditions, and is it possible?
Yeah, I think the first thing is going to be, it's not a one size fits all, right? Some people might be feeling these symptoms and their tests come back and not too shabby, right? There's very, very small changes to be had, and there's nothing too crazy to dive into. Whereas, like, other people can come back and have, like, so many, I don't want to say problems, but so many things out of range that it
Mm-hmm.
can feel super overwhelming to kind of tackle those. So, just knowing, like, no matter if you have one or two things out of range or everything is out of range, like, just knowing that your body, you have to trust it to be able to heal.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like the first thing is like trust you, trust yourself, trust your body, because knowing and like manifesting the fact that your body is strong and your mind is strong and like it wants to feel good. I think that's the number one thing is like trusting yourself.
Yeah. I love hearing you say that to our clients too, like at the beginning of interpretations, the beginning of lab reviews, like trust that, your body wants to heal, that it can heal, and now let's dive into it. So awesome. Well, we'll definitely have to do some follow-ups on these topics because I definitely want to go deeper, but we'll leave it at that for today. So thank you guys so much for listening. You can find me and Julia in the show notes on Instagram. And if you're curious about working with us, feel free to fill out an application in the link in description as well. All right. See you back here next week.